Martin Scorsese is my favorite filmmaker of all time. There's no other director who has quite as many bangers as he does, giving us 50 years of amazing cinema. So today, I'm going to attempt the impossible, and I'll be ranking every feature-length Martin Scorsese film. And before I get started, if you love movies and want to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that is greatly appreciated. And without further ado, let's get right into it. At number 26, Age of Innocence. I feel like this might already feel like a hot take, but this movie just didn't connect with me at all. Don't get me wrong, this is still a good movie. In fact, if this was in somebody's top 5, I wouldn't even be that surprised. The acting was great, and the whole thing looks beautiful. The 3 leads all gave amazing performances, but the way the characters are presented, I just don't like any of them. And the pacing makes this the most boring movie in his filmography. It doesn't have any of the characteristics that I really come to Scorsese movies for. The kinetic energy that he's so amazing at capturing was nowhere to be found here. After Goodfellas was such a hit, I feel like he may have tried to make this to prove that he could do a different type of movie. But just because you can, doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be worth it. I think maybe he was hoping this would be his Barry Lyndon, but this does not have the personality and character that Barry Lyndon does. Again, not a bad movie, but it's just not what I want from a Martin Scorsese movie. I do think that I would love to see him tackle a traditional love story later on in his career, but this one doesn't do it for me. Number 25, New York, New York. Scorsese making an ode to 1940s and 50s musicals with 70s sensibilities sounds like it could be one of the greatest movies ever made, but what it ended up being is a drawn-out look into one of the most toxic relationships put to film. I did enjoy this movie. Robert De Niro and Liza Minnelli are both great in the lead roles, and the cinematography is pretty solid and does a good job at capturing the 1950s Technicolor magic. I would have liked to see them take a little more advantage of the old school Hollywood set design, because there's a few moments where it really popped very nicely, but also some large chunks where it just felt like a regular movie. The 2 lead characters were pretty compelling, and their love story was good for a while, but after about half the movie, it becomes hard to watch. Seeing the toxicity of this relationship over the course of the movie that's a little too long makes for a not too enjoyable experience. Musicals should be a big and extravagant fun experience, but this is kind of a downer. Overall, this was an okay movie that could have been a lot better. And like I said in the last one, I'd really like to see him take on a musical at this point in his career, now that he has a lot more experience directing in different styles. Number 24, Who's That Knocking at My Door? Scorsese's very first feature film is a cool time capsule. Most of his films are so refined in their vision and artistry, so it's neat seeing him find his directorial voice in real time. Overall, this is an okay movie, but there's enough here that I really like. Harvey Keitel gives a great performance as the lead, and Marty has such a knack for making the camera move in an interesting way and creating a captivating look of the film. The plot is really bare bones, and overall not that interesting. It's so low stakes that it's hard to care about what's happening at times, but with all the flaws of the script, he makes up for it with this being one of the most experimental movies of his career. While 60% of this is sort of a boring love story, essentially 40% of it is cool 1960s experimental music videos. In these scenes, Marty and Thelma Shoemaker, his editor, were able to make some remarkable scenes melding music and filmmaking. Even though this is one of his weaker films, seeing his humble beginnings and the incredible potential that he shows with this one makes it worth a watch. Number 23, Gangs of New York. This may seem low, but you have to realize, all the movies from here on out are at least 3.5 stars out of 5 for me, so I enjoy them all quite a bit. My favorite thing about this movie is the set design. It just takes you to another world. To my knowledge, this wasn't based on true events, but it was based on real people and dynamics of New York at the time. But even though this is based on reality, it almost feels like it's a fantasy world with how everything is presented. The performances are so big, and along with the set and direction, it all has a very outlandish feeling to it. The cast of this is great too. Daniel Day-Lewis gives one of the best villain performances ever. Leonardo DiCaprio's performance gets overshadowed because of how great Lewis is, but he still does a great job. And all of the supporting characters feel right there in this world and are amazing at setting the tone of the movie. The only person that doesn't quite fit to me is Cameron Diaz, who just doesn't look like someone who belongs in the early 1900s. She is the face of someone who has definitely used the internet, if that makes any sense. The plot of this one is interesting because it almost feels like a trial run for what he does in The Departed, with Leo playing sort of a double agent within the mafia. And while I don't think it's quite as good as The Departed, It does give us some incredible scenes at the climax once Daniel Day-Lewis and Leo start going head to head. Overall, this is a good but flawed flick. Number 22, Mean Streets. If this wasn't the first gangster movie in Martin Scorsese's career, then I think it would have been forgotten with a bunch of other very good 70s crime movies. There's a raw, chaotic energy to this movie that captures a lot of what Scorsese goes on to perfect later in his career, and it's cool seeing this unhinged version of it. Harvey Keitel does a great job in the lead role, and seeing a young De Niro play such an antagonizing character at this point in his career is awesome, even though I'm not in love with the character itself. The whole look of this movie is instantly iconic too, with Marty coining and perfecting a lot of the techniques that he'd go on to use later on. There is so much charisma in the filmmaking and performances from top to bottom. That charisma brings the energy that I love from the best of his movies, but it also feels a little sloppy at times here. The rawness of this movie is its greatest strength, but also its weakness, because he has so many movies later on that deal in similar themes in similar ways, but just aren't as rough around the edges as this one is. Number 21, Boxcar Bertha. I feel like John Cassavetes would slap me across the face for having this one above Mean Streets, and I'm not even sure if this is technically a better movie than Mean Streets, but I definitely enjoyed it more. That sweaty, down south Bonnie and Clyde outlaws in the run type of story is so refreshing in a filmography full of inner city tales of street life. Barbara Hershey is great in the lead role as Bertha. There's only a couple of movies with female leads in his filmography, and I think they both work incredibly well. Most of his movies deal with toxic masculinity, and this one follows a young girl who's caught up in that masculine world of crime, and how she deals with it. This is one of the cheaper movies that he's made, and you could tell by the look of it. But while that was a flaw of Mean Streets for me, I think it works with the sweaty, down south vibe of this one. There's a few moments where you can see that he was really experimenting with his style and craft, and it shows the potential of what he was about to go on to do for the next 4 decades. The whole 4-man outlaw crew is really great, but I have to give a special shout out to David Carradine, who perfectly plays this sleazeball that you grow to love throughout the movie. The love story between him and Bertha is unexpectedly beautiful at times, and the ending shot is one of the coolest things in his whole filmography. Number 20, Shutter Island. I really wish that Marty made more horror movies throughout his career, because he's such a master at creating this dark and disturbing vibe. This movie is flawed, but very entertaining. The atmosphere is crafted to make you unsure about anything and uncomfortable about everything. Leonardo DiCaprio is great here. He's so great at capturing the essence of characters who want to be doing the right thing, but just have this inherent darkness within them. I think the flaw of this movie comes with the twist. The twist itself is effective, but when you build a movie around a twist, it makes all the lead up to it a little flimsy on a rewatch. It's a cool idea in concept, but in execution, it's sort of a novelty. I had known the twist going into watching this, so I was able to see how much they were straining with each plot point to have it make sense in the end, and I don't think it all worked 100% of the time. This almost feels more like a Christopher Nolan movie to me than a Martin Scorsese one, which isn't a bad thing. Number 19, The Aviator. I always view this one hand in hand with Shutter Island, as two very entertaining but flawed collaborations between Leonardo DiCaprio and Martin Scorsese. I think biopics are very hard to pull off, especially because we've seen so many at this point, and they all hit familiar beats, so it's almost like watching the same movie we've seen before, but with a different character. I do think that this one does a good job at separating itself though, at least for a while. This movie is super long, but I think the first 2 hours of the movie are just about perfect. He's able to set up this crazy character and all of his quirks and idiosyncrasies very effectively, and I was on board with all of it pretty quickly. I also really love the parts with Cate Blanchett, where she plays Katharine Hepburn. Seeing Scorsese get to play with old Hollywood in that way really just made me happy, and I thought it was a very nice touch to bring some character to that typical biopic formula. But as the movie went on, the third act just fell apart to me. It felt like the movie simultaneously went on for too long and wrapped up too quickly, making me leave with a sour taste in my mouth after giving me a great first 2 hours. Number 18, Kundun. Going from one biopic to another, here's where this list takes another big jump in quality. From here on out, all of these are 4-star movies and above. This is a beautiful portrayal of a life that is so unique that it's almost hard to believe. This is told in such an epic and grand scale that it's hard to believe that it's about a real guy who is alive today. I have to give a huge shout out to the cinematographer Roger Deakins and the composer Philip Glass who did the score, because this movie looks and sounds incredible. They did such a great job at capturing the beauty and magnitude of the Tibetan landscapes and culture. The main cast was played by some of the real family and friends of the real-life Dalai Lama, and that's cool in theory, but having no experienced actors definitely brings this down a little bit, and a lot of the dialogue feels stilted and not natural because of it. This is definitely one of the most underappreciated movies of his whole career, so definitely check this out. Number 17, Casino. Casino was one of the most exciting and colorful movies of his whole career. The acting is great, the music is catchy, and the whole experience of watching it is such a fun time. But there's just nothing about this movie that you can't find somewhere in a better Scorsese movie. If you want to see a story about the American dream and how it's corrupted by excess, then watch The Wolf of Wall Street. If you want to see a movie about the inner workings of mid-20th century organized crime, then watch Goodfellas. And if you want to watch a movie where Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci are friends, and Joe Pesci is a little bit of a loose cannon who ends up sleeping with Robert De Niro's wife, then you could just watch Raging Bull. This sort of is like a greatest hits for Scorsese, and that's not a bad thing. Most greatest hits albums have some of the best music of all time on them. And even though this has all been seen before, there's still not much to dislike about the movie. All of the performances are incredible. This might even be my favorite Joe Pesci performance, which is saying a lot because he's always amazing. And this is right up there with Basic Instinct at the top tier of Sharon Stone. And that's not even to mention De Niro, who's phenomenal here and super underrated within his pantheon of great performances. I do think that every time I watch this, it does separate itself from its similarities to his other works, so it may get higher in the rankings in the future, but for now, I think it's solid right here. Number 16, Bringing Out the Dead. Martin Scorsese directing a Paul Schrader script starring Nicolas Cage. Sign me the fuck up. This movie sort of feels like Taxi Driver on no sleep and a whole lot of cocaine. It's one of the darkest movies in Scorsese's career, but it also is kind of a dark comedy at times. The whole movie you're waiting for Nicolas Cage to fly off the handle, and he perfectly treads that line between being that wacky Nick Cage that we all know and love, and also being a great leading man in a respectable movie. Watching this literally feels like you haven't slept for days, and accomplishing that feeling is all due to the direction. Scorsese puts the viewer right there in the ambulance with Cage and his co-driver, and you face all of the fear, sadness, and adrenaline that they do. The supporting cast is amazing too, and I especially want to shout out Ving Rhames, who is hilarious every single time he's on screen. His performance helps bring this from a cool after-midnight thriller to a fucked up and hilarious dark comedy. This movie has just enough of that same Scorsese tropes to feel familiar, while bringing a completely different feeling to the table. I love it. Number 15, The Irishman, the final installment of Martin Scorsese's masterful catalog of mafia movies. It's rare that a director is able to make a film at the tail end of their career that is up to the high bar of quality as their best work, but also thematically takes a look at his own career and sums up 50 years of work at the same time. This really feels like one of the more personal films in his catalog, and the reunion of him and De Niro felt like it came at the perfect time for both of them. This has got to be the best leading De Niro performance since the turn of the millennium. The only negative thing I could say about it wasn't really De Niro's fault at all. The whole de-aging part of this movie does sort of take me out of it a bit, and I think it's going to age worse with time. In 30 years, when we have seamless CGI, we're going to look back at this, and I think we're going to wish that they just cast Tom Hardy or something to play young De Niro instead. But I digress. For a movie this long, it wouldn't be surprising if the pacing was an issue, but that's not the case at all. He's able to capture the energy of his earlier mafia films, while slowing down and really capturing the emotional side of life, and looking at his own mortality. I can't wait to continue to rewatch this one as I get older too. I think it's really in touch with humanity itself, and the more life experiences I get, the more this one grows on me. Number 14, The Last Temptation of Christ. Religion is a topic and theme that runs through Martin Scorsese's entire filmography, but this is one of the few movies where he dives into it head on. This is one of the most ambitious movies of his career, telling the story of Jesus Christ and attempting to humanize him in a way that puts us in his shoes would be daunting for any filmmaker, but he does an amazing job with this. It takes a little while to get going. Seeing Willem Dafoe Jesus talk to Harvey Keitel as Judas does take some getting used to, but as it goes on, this becomes one of the most powerful films of his whole career. Keitel as Judas never really clicks for me, but Dafoe's portrayal of Jesus is incredible. The way that he's able to capture the magnitude of the decision that Jesus has to make, feeling the literal fate of humanity on his shoulders, is just amazing. This movie does a great job of feeling the weight of a story about God, while also bringing so much humanity into each character. And everything comes together at the end, with one of the best third acts in any movie of his career. As a story that we've all known since we were young, it somehow gets to the point where I had no idea what was going to transpire next, and it ends at the exact moment that it should, leaving me exhilarated right up into its last seconds. Number 13, Hugo. I was not looking forward to watching this one for the longest time, but once I finally watched it, I fell in love. I wish so bad that I was able to watch this when I was a little kid. Scorsese does an amazing job at creating a world full of magic and wonder. The steampunk clock gear aesthetic took some getting used to, but once I got into it, I loved how it set each scene in the real world, while giving it a little fantastical edge to it. This movie was also genuinely funny. It felt like the best of the children's movies that I grew up on. I'm also a huge sucker for any movies that are about the history of movies. I had no idea that cinema history was a part of this movie at all, and such an interesting part of its history at that. I had no knowledge about Georges Méliès outside of A Trip to the Moon, so seeing him and his legacy portrayed here was awesome, and opened me up to a whole new filmmaker to dive into. If you were like me and intrigued by this movie but never interested enough to check it out, then definitely change that today and go give this a try. Number 12, Raging Bull. This is the first of the films that are typically thought of as Scorsese's masterpieces, and it really is that good. The cinematography is breathtaking, the black and white film looks phenomenal, and the boxing scenes are some of the best looking in movie history. Robert De Niro gives arguably his greatest performance ever, playing the dim-witted heavyweight champion, Jake LaMotta. His performance is so layered. By the end of the movie, you end up hating this character, while also feeling so bad for him. Joe Pesci is also amazing as Joey, and Kathy Moriarty, who plays Vicky, is absolutely incredible. I'm not too familiar with her other films, but she's right up there with these other acting heavyweights in here. Quality-wise, this is among his best work, no doubt. But the reason why it's so low on this list is because it's so much of a downer. It is hard to watch this character go through life. I feel like this movie would get better on repeat viewings, but the only problem is I have no interest in watching this again, because it's just not a good time to watch. This earns every bit of its classic status, and should be watched by anyone who loves movies, but not one that I really enjoy, if that makes any sense. Number 11, Killers of the Flower Moon. This one is very similar to Raging Bull because it's so well made and is filled with phenomenal performances, but its subject matter is so heavy and dark that it's really not a movie that you're meant to enjoy. Leonardo DiCaprio is so amazing in the lead role. It's one of the truly transformative performances of his career, and it actually reminds me a lot of De Niro's performance in Raging Bull, because he's such a hateable character, but his malice is played with such stupidity and absent-mindedness that you almost feel bad for him by the end of it. And Lily Gladstone's performance is the exact opposite, while being just as amazing. Leo's character tells us what he's about from the very first scene, and he always wears what he's thinking out in the open, whereas Gladstone plays this character as so stoic, still giving us the same amount of information with her character, but with some of the smallest and most nuanced acting that I've really ever seen. And De Niro gives my favorite supporting performance from him since Terry Gilliam's Brazil, playing just a truly maniacally evil person, pretty much evil incarnate. The direction of this movie is so powerful, and the discourse online doesn't give it nearly enough credit for just how nuanced it all is. The ending with the radio show is one of the best directorial decisions that I've seen this decade so far. This is an amazing movie, but again, not one that I'm itching to rewatch anytime soon. Number 10, The King of Comedy. For years, this was one of the most underrated movies of Martin Scorsese's career, but over the past few years, it's been having a bit of a cultural reevaluation, and for good reason. This movie feels more relevant every single day. The way it looks at society's obsession with celebrity and relationship to media in general feels like a commentary on the social media age. And Rupert Pupkin, along with Travis Bickle, make for a very real look at mental health and isolation in the modern day. This movie is super funny too, with the three leads all doing their part to keep the laughs hitting and natural within the story being told. I want to give a special shout out to Diane Abbott, who takes this from a very good movie to something undeniably classic. This film's legacy is now forever intertwined with Joker, and I can understand why that would ruin this film for some people, but I actually think both movies are great, and there's room in cinema history for both of them. Number 9, After Hours. Going from one of the funniest movies on this list to another one that might even be more humorous. We are now in the 5-star section of this list. Everything we get from here on out has the best that cinema has to offer, in my opinion. This movie does such an amazing job at capturing the real-life curiosity and anxiety of having a crazy night like this, and also feels like a fantastical experience, akin to The Wizard of Oz or something. Griffin Dunne does an amazing job as the film's lead. Most Scorsese movies have pretty much like one of 4 or 5 actors playing the lead role, and Dunne brings an energy that is slightly different while having a familiar feeling. This movie keeps getting crazier and crazier, and we rely on Dunne's reactions to it all to keep the film grounded. There's also just nothing better than a one crazy night movie, and this epitomizes what makes those types of stories so great to experience. I always view this and The King of Comedy together in my head as the 2 underappreciated 80s comedies in his filmography. But this one gets the slight edge for me because of how unique it feels in his catalog filled with American and religious epics. This is just the story of a guy who has one crazy night, and I love it for that. Number 8, Cape Fear. This might be another hot take having this up so high. Cape Fear is Martin Scorsese's crack at making a horror film, and in my opinion, he does an excellent job. It embraces all of the schlock and cheesiness of the genre, and makes for something aware of the tropes of the genre, while also being legitimately frightening. The main event of this film, as with most movies on this list, is Robert De Niro. This is a transformative performance by him, and easily one of the top 2 or 3 performances of his career. His character is so cartoonish, but so scary at the same time. For the past 25 years, I feel like De Niro in most roles plays some version of himself, but this is a complete transformation, and I love it. I also need to give a shout out to Juliette Lewis, who is phenomenal in this. That one scene with her and De Niro in the theater is one of the most nerve-wracking and suspenseful I've ever seen, and her going bar for bar with prime Robert De Niro is phenomenal to watch. I know a lot of people complain about the ending, but by that point I was already so far on board that there was pretty much nothing this movie could have done to turn me against it. I so badly wish that we got more Martin Scorsese horror movies and thrillers, because he so clearly has a great grasp on what makes these genres amazing. He could have easily been another master of suspense if he wanted to, and this is Exhibit A. Number 7, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. I was expecting not to like this one. It looked like a boring slice of life romance that wouldn't be up my alley at all, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. In reality, this is one of the most engaging coming-of-age stories I've ever seen. Alice might be my favorite character in any Scorsese movie. She feels so real that I felt like I've known her for years after watching this. Even though she's a single mom from out west, I can relate to her so much. A story about chasing your dreams and finding yourself can be hard to pull off, but when it works well, there's nothing quite like it. Her dynamic with her son is such an amazing relationship too. Every scene with them two driving in the car had me cracking up, and their back and forth banter felt like real conversations I've had with my family. Even though this movie is romantic, heartwarming, and emotional, it can't be stated enough just how funny this is too. It really has everything. I was truly blown away by how much I love this one. People usually jump right from Mean Streets to Taxi Driver when discussing his filmography, but this is Martin Scorsese's first amazing film in my opinion. Number 6, Silence. This is the third and final film of his religious epic trilogy, and this movie takes the best of what Last Temptation and Kundun do, and really makes one of the best movies of the last decade. Narratively, this feels very similar to Apocalypse Now, and it really lives up to the magnitude of a comparison like that. Andrew Garfield gives a career-defining performance in this. The entire movie revolves around things that aren't physical, his faith, and his lack of faith, and he's able to take us on this journey using the nuances of his acting here. It's such a shame that this went under the radar when it was released. If this got half of the press that Killers of the Flower Moon got, then this would be widely thought of as one of the best films of recent years. The cinematography and production design are incredible, making this an immersive experience. Everything that Garfield feels, we feel, and we're right there with him. And the ending is great too, and the way that Christianity and faith are portrayed really blows the other films with these themes out of the water. It's so still, so calm in its presentation, forcing the viewer to meet the movie at its core every step of the way. Number 5, The Color of Money. Going from one of the heaviest Scorsese movies ever to one of the lightest. This movie is so low stakes that it's easy to forget about within a filmography this stacked. but that simplicity is a part of what makes this a perfect movie. This might be the greatest sports movie ever made. It's got all the tropes that you'd expect from your typical sports flick, but it's made with the touch of an expert filmmaker. The low stakes of this movie let Scorsese be able to really try some cool stuff with the editing and how this is shot. There's a lot in here that you can see him take with him later in his career. Paul Newman is one of my favorite actors ever, and especially this late period of his career. He's so great at playing these characters with so much regret and so much history and charisma that you can't help but root for him. This feels more like a late period Scorsese movie, akin to The Irishman, but it's cool seeing him reflect on aging and his own mortality at this point in his career too. This is a classic movie star role, and the movie just lets Newman cook, and it's so amazing for that. Tom Cruise's performance is hilarious to me, and the movie does such a good job at highlighting how both of these characters tick from the differences and similarities between them. It also helps that Poole is straight up just cool as hell. As we get into the top 5, most of these movies are just so much fun to watch, and this is no exception. Number 4, The Departed. This might be the Martin Scorsese movie that I've seen the most times in my life. It's just so much fun. The energy of this thing is made of straight electricity. The mafia world is familiar enough, but setting it in Boston gives it a whole new energy compared to his New York films. The cast is so stacked, and they're all giving some of their best work. The performances may feel over the top, but don't let that fool you. With everyone playing double agents, they each have to make so many small, nuanced choices as actors, making sure everything they do makes sense for the character that they are playing, but also for the character that their character is playing in that scene. In a career filled with great Leonardo DiCaprio performances, this might be his best, and Damon is right there with him. This also just might be Mark Wahlberg and Jack Nicholson's last great performance of their careers, and it's amazing to see. At this point in his career, Scorsese had his bag of tricks, and he wasn't afraid to use them. As much as I love his versatility throughout the years, sometimes I love seeing him do a movie that feels exactly how you'd expect, and how you want it to. Number 3, The Wolf of Wall Street. This movie has gotten a bit of a polarizing reputation over the past couple years, but I don't think it deserves that. It's simple. Martin Scorsese has been making movies about bad people, bad Americans, taking advantage of the systems in place for them for years. He's been doing that over the course of his entire career, and this is his magnum opus of those themes. This movie is all about excess, from the acting to the filmmaking, to every single thing about it, and every single person involved understood the assignment. I know that I just said that The Departed was Leonardo DiCaprio's best performance, but I may have been a little early on that, because this one right here just might be it. Jonah Hill is also amazing in here. This is possibly the funniest movie of Scorsese's career, and honestly one of the last funny big movies ever made. And most of that is due to Jonah Hill. It really is crazy when you realize that Martin Scorsese directed this in his 70s. This movie has such a youthful energy, and it really is what starts to separate him from his contemporaries when you look at their careers side by side. He has films that define decades for pretty much about 5 decades in a row, which is unheard of. When it comes to movies that are just as entertaining as they are impressive, this really might take the cake, and truly one of my favorite films of my lifetime. Number 2, Taxi Driver. I really don't know what I'll be able to say about this movie that hasn't already been said. This is one of the most critically respected and beloved movies in the history of cinema, and it deserves every bit of that. Every single thing about this movie works perfectly. The dirty New York 1970s vibe is probably the best setting for this type of story. Robert De Niro is the GOAT, so he has so many amazing acting performances of his career, but this might be his crowning achievement. Travis Bickle was such a captivating character to watch. You almost feel bad for him because he just needs someone in his life to help him, but he's never going to find it because he's in a never-ending loop of his own delusions. The camera work and editing is just straight up some of the best that you will ever see, and it's so meticulously planned and plotted out. Some of the shots in here have just become synonymous with cinema itself over the years. And there's something about this movie. Even though it's a little dark and disturbing, it always draws me back for another viewing, and it gets better every single time. The other thing is just how ahead of its time this movie is. The internet is now filled with so many Travis Bickles, and if this movie is any indication, then quite frankly we're all doomed. But if we're doomed, at least we have this movie to enjoy along the way. And at number 1, Goodfellas. I know it's cliche to say, but this movie is just amazing. It has all of the attitude and kinetic energy that you'd expect from Scorsese's most bodacious pictures, but also so much of the craft that you'd get with his quieter films. This comes pretty much right around the middle point of his career, as his instincts and experience were meeting at the perfect point to make this movie that sums up everything about his career. This movie was sort of a rite of passage for me, as I'm sure it was for most men around my age. It was one of the first rated R movies that I was shown by my older brothers, and since then it's become one of my most rewatched. Of course, it's rewatchable because of how fun it is, but also because of how much detail was put into every shot and scene. I've seen this probably a dozen times in my life, and every time I catch something new. His movies usually feature the same 3 or 4 actors in the main roles. Even though this movie features a lot of the usual suspects for Scorsese pictures, having Ray Liotta in the lead role is such a perfect choice. To say this was a career-defining role would be an understatement. He knocks this movie out of the park, and of course De Niro and Pesci filling it out is perfect. Joe Pesci in this movie probably has to go into the Supporting Actor Hall of Fame. Every scene he's in is just so iconic. Not only is this the best Scorsese movie of all time, but this is straight up one of the best movies ever made, and there's only a handful that I would put above it. This almost isn't even a movie at this point. It's a cultural touchstone for so many people. This film has been referenced and quoted so many times throughout my life that it's just an undeniable classic, and without a doubt, the best Scorsese movie ever made. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. If you got through this entire video, then I can't thank you guys enough. Make sure to drop your Scorsese ranking down in the comments. I want to give a special shout out to my patrons. Right now the Patreon is mostly focusing on my hip hop channel, but if some of you guys are interested in it, I'd be happy to have the Deaf Gold film side of things share the spotlight over there. I got a few really cool video ideas planned for the next few months, so stay tuned, stay safe, and stay deaf. Thanks for watching.